What if your perfect life was built on lies? She had everything: a loving husband, a beautiful daughter, a home filled with warmth. But perfection is fragile. It starts with a touch, a glance that lingers too long, a moment that shouldn't have happened. Guilt creeps in, but so does temptation. And just when she thinks she's the only one with secrets, she stumbles upon his. 2 betrayals. 1 marriage on the edge. How do you fix something that's already broken? Stay. This is only the beginning. Ivy Quinn stood by the kitchen window, her fingers absent-mindedly tracing the rim of her coffee cup. Outside, the morning sun bathed the garden in a golden glow, illuminating the dewdrops clinging to the leaves. The white picket fence, the neatly trimmed hedges, the soft laughter of her daughter playing in the yard, it was the kind of life people envied. A picture-perfect home, a loving husband, a beautiful child. But perfection was a delicate thing. Lily's laughter rang out as she twirled around the yard, her tiny hands reaching for the butterflies flitting above the flower beds. Ivy smiled, but the weight in her chest didn't lift. "Mommy, look." Lily's voice was bright with excitement as she pointed toward a ladybug perched on her fingertip. "That's beautiful, sweetheart," Ivy called back, forcing warmth into her voice. Behind her, the coffee in her cup had gone cold. Just like the empty side of the bed Knox had left that morning. He was a good man. A good father. But work had always come first. Even when he was home, he wasn't really there. His mind was always tethered to something else. A deal that needed closing, a client that needed attention, a phone that never stopped ringing. "I'll make it up to you," he always said. "Just one more trip, one more late night, and then I'll slow down." 4 years of marriage, and she was still waiting. Ivy exhaled, setting the untouched coffee aside. She shouldn't complain. They had everything: comfort, stability, security. But as she watched her daughter play alone in the yard, the silence of the house pressing in around her, she wondered. Was it enough? The first time Ivy met Alex, she barely noticed him. It was a warm afternoon, the air thick with the scent of freshly cut grass. Knox had hired him 6 months ago, just to help around the house while I'm away, he had said. He's reliable. Quiet. Won't be a bother. And for the most part, he wasn't. Alex spent his days tending to the garden, repairing small things around the house, and keeping an eye on Lily when Ivy was busy. He moved through their home like a shadow, present, yet unobtrusive. Always polite, always working. He had a quiet, almost effortless charm, though Ivy had never paid him much attention. To her, he was just another fixture in the backdrop of her life. Until that evening. She had been late coming home. Traffic had been unbearable, the city lights blurring through the windshield as exhaustion settled deep in her bones. By the time she pulled into the driveway, the house was quiet, the only light spilling from the kitchen window. Inside, everything was in perfect order. The toys Lily had scattered earlier were neatly placed in a basket, the dishes from breakfast washed and put away. Even the pillows on the couch had been fluffed, their edges aligned with meticulous precision. And there, standing by the dining table, was Alex. He looked up as she entered, his expression unreadable. His sleeves were rolled up, a faint sheen of sweat on his arms from working outside. "You didn't have to do all this," Ivy said, surprised. "Didn't seem right to leave it a mess," he replied simply, wiping his hands on a towel. "Lily's already in bed. She had a good day." Ivy hesitated, her fingers grazing the back of a chair. The room felt different. Warmer. Quieter. She wasn't sure why, but for the first time in a long while, she didn't feel completely alone. "Thank you," she murmured, unsure of what else to say. Alex just smiled. It was a small thing, barely there, but there was something steady about it. reassuring. And for reasons she couldn't quite explain, Ivy found herself lingering just a little longer. The house felt different when Knox was away. It wasn't just the absence of his voice, or the emptiness of his side of the bed. It was the stillness, the way the silence stretched between the walls, making everything seem softer, more intimate. He had left that morning for a 5-day business trip, kissing Ivy's cheek in a rushed goodbye, before disappearing through the front door. Lily was spending the night at her grandmother's. And for the first time in a long while, Ivy found herself completely alone. Or at least, she should have been. Alex was still there. It had started innocently enough. A casual conversation on the back porch, a drink shared beneath the glow of the garden lights. They talked about small things, about Lily's endless curiosity, about the stubborn rosebush Alex had been trying to revive, about the places Ivy had dreamed of visiting, but never had the chance to. Somewhere between the laughter and the easy conversation, she felt it, something shifting in the air between them. And then, it happened. His hand brushed against hers, light as a whisper. Neither of them pulled away. The warmth of his skin lingered, and Ivy's breath caught in her throat. She should have moved. She should have ended it there. But she didn't. Alex looked at her, his expression unreadable, his gaze flickering to her lips for just a second, just long enough for her to notice. And then, before she could think, before she could stop it, he leaned in. The kiss was soft, tentative, a question neither of them should have been asking. But the moment their lips met, Ivy felt something inside her unravel. A craving she hadn't acknowledged. A hunger she had long buried. It lasted only a second before reality came crashing back. "No," she whispered, pulling away, her pulse racing. Alex immediately stepped back, his jaw tightening. "Ivy, This was a mistake," she cut him off, shaking her head as if that could erase what had just happened. She turned and walked inside, shutting the door behind her. That night, she lay awake, Knox's absence heavier than ever, guilt pressing against her chest like a weight she couldn't lift. It wouldn't happen again. She wouldn't let it. But the heart doesn't follow rules. And just a few days later, it happened again. This time, neither of them stopped. And Ivy knew she had crossed a line she could never uncross. Ivy thought the guilt would fade with time. She had convinced herself that what happened with Alex was just a moment of weakness, a mistake that would never be repeated. But the lie she told herself felt as suffocating as the lie she told Knox. Every morning, she woke up next to him, pretending she was still the devoted wife. Pretending nothing had changed. Pretending she didn't feel the heat of Alex's touch still lingering on her skin. But Knox was pretending too. She just didn't realize it until the night she found the messages. It was late. Knox had fallen asleep on the couch, his phone buzzing quietly on the coffee table beside him. Normally, Ivy would have ignored it. But something made her look. A name she didn't recognize. Elena. Her stomach twisted as she reached for the phone, her hands shaking. The screen was still lit, the message glaring back at her like a confession. "I miss you. When can I see you again?" Ivy's breath caught in her throat. She scrolled up, her pulse pounding in her ears. "Last night was amazing. She doesn't suspect anything, does she? I hate sneaking around, but I can't stay away from you." The room suddenly felt too small, the air too thick. Her grip on the phone tightened as she stared at Knox, asleep, oblivious. A strange, bitter laugh almost escaped her lips. She had spent weeks drowning in guilt, believing she was the only one betraying their marriage. But here he was, living his own secret life. She should have felt rage. Betrayal. But all she felt was an unbearable, crushing weight. Because now, there was no high ground. No victim. No villain. Just two people, who had failed each other in the worst way possible. And the marriage they had built, the life they had sworn to protect, was already in ruins. The weight of the truth had become unbearable. For days, Ivy carried it like a stone lodged deep in her chest, suffocating her, pressing against her ribs until she could barely breathe. Every time Knox kissed her goodnight, every time he laughed with Lily at the dinner table, every time he touched her with the hands that had also touched someone else, she felt like she was drowning. Enough. That evening, after Lily had drifted into the safety of sleep, Ivy stood in the dimly lit kitchen, her fingers gripping the cool edge of the counter as she waited. Knox walked in, running a tired hand through his hair. "Hey," he said, giving her a small smile before pouring himself a glass of whiskey. Ivy swallowed. "We need to talk." Something in her voice made him stop. He turned to face her fully, his expression shifting, guarded. "What is it?" She exhaled, forcing the words out before she could change her mind. "I cheated on you." Silence. For a moment, the only sound in the room was the quiet hum of the refrigerator. Knox didn't move. Didn't blink. The glass in his hand hovered just above the counter, frozen midair. Then, slowly, he set it down. "What did you just say?" His voice was eerily calm. Too calm. Ivy's hands trembled, but she didn't look away. "I cheated on you," she repeated, barely above a whisper. "With Alex." The name shattered whatever composure Knox had left. His jaw clenched, his shoulders stiffened, and his fingers curled into fists at his sides. "Alex." He said the name like it burned his tongue. "The guy I hired. The guy I let into our home." Ivy nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. Knox let out a harsh, bitter laugh, shaking his head as he paced the kitchen. "Jesus Christ, Ivy." His voice was sharp, cutting, filled with something dangerously close to betrayal. But then, he stopped. And Ivy saw it. The way his face changed. The flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. A realization. A guilt she knew too well. And suddenly, she just knew. Her heart pounded. "You're not surprised?" It wasn't a question. Knox ran a hand over his face, exhaling heavily. "Ivy. You're not surprised," she repeated, stepping closer, her voice rising. "Why? Why aren't you screaming at me? Why aren't you furious?" He said nothing. And in that silence, Ivy felt the truth settle into her bones. Her lips parted, her breath shaky. "How long have you been seeing her?" Knox's eyes met hers, dark and tired. A pause. A long, agonizing pause. And then, finally, 6 months. The exact amount of time Alex had been in their lives. The exact moment their marriage had started to rot from the inside. Ivy let out a sharp breath, a strangled mix between a laugh and a sob. Her hands pressed against her face, her skin burning with shame, anger, regret, so many emotions tangled together she could hardly separate them. She had been so consumed by her own guilt, so wrapped up in her own mistakes, that she had never even considered Knox might be making the same ones. For the first time, they stood together, stripped bare of every illusion, every lie, every pretense of the life they had built. Two strangers in their own home. Two traitors. Two people who had shattered each other in the worst way possible. And now, there was nothing left to do but face the wreckage. Ivy sat on the edge of their bed, staring at the floor, her mind a storm of tangled thoughts. The air between her and Knox was thick, heavy with words left unsaid, with pain neither of them knew how to put into sentences. They had destroyed each other. But walking away would destroy Lily. Knox sat across from her, elbows resting on his knees, his hands clasped together, as if he was holding on to something invisible, something fragile. He looked exhausted. Not just physically, but in a way that ran deeper. Like a man who had spent too long pretending everything was fine, only to watch it all fall apart anyway. Finally, he broke the silence. "I don't want to lose our family." His voice was quiet, but firm. "No matter what we've done. I don't want Lily to grow up in a broken home." Ivy's throat tightened. Neither of them deserved forgiveness. But Lily deserved a mother and a father. She deserved a home, not a battlefield. "I don't either," Ivy admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Knox nodded, staring at his hands for a long moment before speaking again. "Then we fix it." She swallowed hard. "How?" Knox exhaled. "We end it. With them. With everything. And we start over." The weight of those words settled in her chest like a stone. Ending it. It was the only way forward. The next morning, Ivy found Alex by the garden, trimming the rose bushes, the same ones he had been trying to save for months. The sight of him, the way his hands moved so carefully, the way he always seemed so steady. It hurt more than she had expected. Alex sensed her presence before she spoke. He turned, wiping his hands on a rag, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Morning, Ivy." She didn't return the smile. She couldn't. "I need to talk to you." Alex studied her for a second, and something in his expression shifted. Maybe he already knew. Maybe he had felt the change the moment she walked toward him. Still, he nodded. "Go ahead." Ivy took a deep breath, steadying herself. "This has to stop. Whatever this is. It's over." Alex didn't react right away. He just watched her, his eyes searching hers, as if he was trying to find some hint that she didn't really mean it. But there was nothing. After a moment, he nodded again, slower this time. "I figured," he said quietly. The lump in Ivy's throat burned, but she forced herself to stand firm. "Knox and we're going to try. For Lily. For our family." Alex's jaw tensed, but he didn't argue. He didn't plead. He had always been the kind of man who accepted the inevitable, even when it hurt. "I understand," he said simply. That was the last conversation they ever had. By the end of the day, Alex was gone. 2 days later, Ivy and Knox sat side by side on a couch that wasn't theirs, in an office that felt too sterile, too cold. "Marriage counseling is a process," the therapist told them, folding her hands in her lap. "This won't be easy. But if you're both willing to fight for each other, we can rebuild from here." Ivy glanced at Knox, and for the first time in a long while, she saw something in his eyes that she had forgotten existed. Hope. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. Healing was not instant. There was no magic moment where everything clicked back into place, no grand apology that erased the damage they had done to each other. There was only time, effort, pain, and the choice to stay. Knox changed first. For years, his job had always come first, the late nights, the endless phone calls, the constant travel. But after everything that happened, something shifted. He started coming home earlier, shutting his laptop before dinner, letting his phone ring unanswered when they were together. One evening, Ivy found him sitting on the floor with Lily, helping her build a castle out of wooden blocks. He was fully present, laughing when the structure collapsed, letting their daughter climb onto his lap as she excitedly planned her next masterpiece. Ivy watched from the doorway, something warm and aching blooming in her chest. He was trying. So was she. She stopped pulling away when he reached for her hand. She started talking to him again, Not just about Lily or the house or the routine things, but about her fears, her guilt, the weight she still carried. And Knox listened. Truly listened. One night, as they lay in bed, Ivy turned to him, her voice barely a whisper in the darkness. "Do you still think about her?" Knox exhaled, his fingers tracing slow circles on the back of her hand. "Sometimes." A pause. "Then, do you still think about him?" Ivy swallowed hard. "Sometimes." Knox nodded, his grip on her hand tightening. "But I think about you more." Ivy blinked back tears. "Me too." They weren't fixed. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But for the first time, they weren't running from the broken pieces. They were picking them up. Together. There were rules now, no more secrets, no more silence, no more pretending. If one of them felt distant, they talked about it. If something hurt, they said it. It wasn't perfect. Some days were harder than others. Some nights, Ivy still lay awake, wondering if the cracks in their marriage would ever fully disappear. But then, in the quiet hours of the morning, Knox would pull her close, pressing a sleepy kiss to her shoulder. Lily would come bouncing into their room, her laughter filling every empty space. And for the first time in a long, long while, Ivy felt something that had once seemed impossible. Hope. The ocean stretched endlessly before them, waves rolling in with a rhythmic whisper, as if the sea itself was breathing. The salty breeze tangled in Ivy's hair, and she closed her eyes, letting it wash over her. It had been a year since everything fell apart. A year since they made the choice to fight for what remained. And now, here they were. Knox stood beside her on the wooden boardwalk, his hands tucked into the pockets of his jacket, his gaze fixed on the horizon. He had brought her here, to this small coastal town, far from the ghosts of their past, for a weekend away. Just the two of them. "You seem peaceful," Knox said, breaking the silence. Ivy turned to him, a small smile tugging at her lips. "I think I am." Knox hesitated, as if turning something over in his mind. Then, he reached into his pocket, and pulled out a small velvet box. Ivy's breath hitched. "I know I never really lost you," he said, voice steady, "but sometimes it felt like I did." He opened the box, revealing a simple but elegant ring, a delicate gold band, nothing extravagant, but undeniably beautiful. Ivy stared, her chest tightening. "Our first rings were a promise," Knox continued. "A promise we broke. This one. This is a new promise. Not to be perfect, not to erase what happened, but to keep choosing each other. Every day." Tears burned at the back of Ivy's eyes. Without hesitation, she held out her hand. Knox slid the ring onto her finger, and Ivy felt something settle inside her. Something deep, something real. She looked at him, really looked at him, and saw not just the man she had once married, but the man who had fought beside her through the wreckage. The man who had chosen to stay. And she knew then, with absolute certainty, that she would choose him too. Again. And again. And again. Ivy used to believe that love was about perfection. That a strong marriage meant never faltering, never breaking. But now, she knew the truth. Love wasn't about being flawless. It was about surviving the flaws. She and Knox were not perfect. They never would be. But they were stronger. A year and a half had passed since the night everything unraveled. Some wounds had faded, others still lingered in quiet moments, but they had learned how to carry them together. They still attended counseling, sitting side by side on the worn leather couch in their therapist's office, talking through the hard days and celebrating the good ones. There were no more secrets. No more silences filled with unspoken words. And most importantly, there was no more taking each other for granted. Knox still worked, but never at the cost of his family. Ivy still had doubts sometimes, but she no longer let them fester in the dark. And together, they built something new, not the perfect marriage they had once imagined, but a real one. One worth fighting for. Lily was their greatest proof that love remained. She laughed loudly, loved fiercely, and never once felt the weight of the past. To her, home was a place of warmth, of safety, of two parents who adored her. And in the end, that was all Ivy and Knox had ever wanted. As Ivy watched their daughter run through the backyard, her laughter ringing through the air, she reached for Knox's hand. He squeezed hers gently, meeting her gaze with a soft, knowing smile. They had broken before. But together, they had rebuilt. And this time, they would not fall. Love was never meant to be easy. It wasn't just laughter and whispered promises in the dark. It was the choice to stay when leaving felt simpler, the decision to heal when the wounds ran deep. Ivy and Knox had fallen, had shattered, had nearly lost everything. But love, true love, wasn't about never breaking. It was about rebuilding. They weren't perfect, and they never would be. But through every mistake, every tear, every painful truth, they had chosen each other. And in the end, that was what love truly was. Not perfection. Not fairy tales. But two people willing to fight. Willing to stay. Willing to begin again. Because love, real love, can survive anything, as long as both hearts refuse to let go.